the new theater of the mind. The Clown Prince of Doom. The Bruce Collins Show, daring to take radio past the point of no return.
Welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show. We're very glad to have you join us. Tonight, we'll talk about Christians persecuted in the Middle East by ISIS. Joining us will be Johnnie Moore. And we'll be talking about little Cherokee people. That's right. I said it. Little Cherokee people, UFOs and Bigfoot, with an author, Mary Joyce. The Bruce Collins Show airs every Friday night at midnight right here at WWPR 1490 AM. You can listen to past archives of the Bruce Collins Show at ipbn-fm.com. That's ipbn-fm.com. And again, IPBN stands for the Intrepid Paradigm Broadcasting Network, the new home of the Bruce Collins Show. And there's a tab for radio shows at ipbn-fm.com. And you can find the Bruce Collins Show there, and it'll take you there to our page and our archives. We would appreciate it if you're able to spread the word for our show by word of mouth, social media, or in whatever creative way you can. Also, we have a Facebook page for the Bruce Collins Show. Please like us there. And you can email the show at bruce_collins_show@AOL.com. And don't forget, this is a fairly new thing, a fairly new phenomenon, the Bruce Collins Show YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, in the search box, put in the Bruce Collins Show, and you'll be taken to the Bruce Collins Show YouTube channel. And now, up next are our guests, Johnnie Moore, talking about ISIS in the Middle East and Christian persecution, and Mary Joyce, the author of Cherokee Little People Were Real, in a moment. And joining us this week is Mr. Johnnie Moore. Johnnie Moore is an author and humanitarian whose adventures have taken him to more than 24 nations. He's worked with genocide victims in Bosnia and Rwanda, established a sustainable agricultural project in Zimbabwe, visited the world's largest refugee camps, and on 5 different occasions has worked in places that were later bombed by Islamic extremists. He has been called one of the world's leading spokespersons for Christians in the Middle East, and he was also the former vice president for executive projects and media relations and campus pastor of Liberty University. He's the author of the new book, Defying ISIS, Preserving Christianity in the Place of Its Birth and in Your Own Backyard. This is a very informative book, Defying ISIS by Johnnie Moore. Johnnie Moore, welcome to the Bruce Collins Show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, first, why did you write this book, Defying ISIS?
Well, I wrote it because we're witnessing a once-in-a-thousand-year crisis in the Middle East. We're watching this terrorist group, ISIS, systematically eliminate the Christians in the region, Christian populations and communities that have existed for nearly 2,000 years, and not enough people in the world are paying attention to it. And most people in the world don't realize that this has actually been going on for a very, very long time, and ISIS isn't starting something, they're finishing it.
Now, the first part of your book is what ISIS is doing. Can you tell us about that? And since the publication of your book, I imagine things have only been ramping up.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that every single day we hear about the new atrocity. I mean, this group is, I mean, actually, just only a few years ago, we couldn't imagine anything worse than Al-Qaeda, and yet, ISIS makes Al-Qaeda look like a walk in the park. I mean, ISIS is so horrific that they've been excommunicated from Al-Qaeda. And so, in the first part of my book, I just wanted to clearly document exactly what had happened and what is happening in the region. And so, it's that documented, it's researched, it's statistical, it's filled with stories and firsthand accounts that I collected in my own visits to the region, as well as, to research teams that I sent into the region. Now, and I was really, really committed to not making things up and not exaggerating things or being alarmist, because I think a lot of people that write in this space are that way. And I happen to believe that the truth is actually scary enough, and it's terrifying. The first section of the book is absolutely terrifying, as I clearly outline what is happening, what has happened, and what they aim to do, not just in Iraq and Syria, but in the United States of America and in every other place where they can gain their influence.
Mm. Are Christians in the Middle East confused by the American response?
Yeah, I mean, to a person, every single Christian I met, whether they're just a congregant or a pastor or a priest or even an archbishop or patriarch, I mean, every single person I met, they told me the same thing, and they said that we feel like we're forgotten. We feel like nobody knows we're here, nobody cares about us. We feel like we've been screaming at the top of our lungs for as long as we can remember, and we're just left to die. And you know what? They're not that wrong. I mean, I remember being in Jordan just over a year ago, sitting down in a meeting with 3 Catholic cardinals and 5 of the Orthodox patriarchs and a number of international Protestant and evangelical leaders. In a meeting convened by the king himself, and listening to Christian leader after Christian leader from Iraq and Syria and Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan say in vivid detail exactly what we saw happen eventually. And they predicted it. They predicted the cities that would be taken. They predicted the ways in which people would be killed. They predicted the threat in almost to the day, and with incredible detail. And they were screaming for the world to pay attention, predicting that this ISIS thing was coming and going to take over their cities and kill people in this horrific way that we've seen again and again. And yet the world didn't have an ear to hear. We just covered our ears and we covered our eyes, and now cities like Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, a city that has had a thriving Christian population for centuries, a city that had continuous worship services every single day for 1,600 years until this year, when the Christians were either all killed or displaced or sold into slavery. And now in this ancient Christian city, there isn't a single Christian left, and there isn't a single church in operation. And some of them have been bombed to smithereens, and others, the crosses have been broken off, and some of the more famous churches have been turned into ISIS prisons or madrasas. I mean, this is a horrific thing that's happening, and the world hasn't given it enough attention.
Your book points out that Islam is the fastest growing religion in Europe. Why is this the case?
Well, I mean, the truth is, it's a combination of things. The first one is demographic. Just generally speaking, this is a culture that has 4 or 5 children on average, compared to the sort of traditional Christian culture in Europe, which is if they have children at all, it's like 1.5 or something. So I think in that level they're growing it. I think secondarily, I mean, obviously, it's the immigration crisis in Europe is exacerbating it. I think there is a certain level of intentionality in it. You see the sort of missionary activity of these communities in Europe. And by the way, I'm not anti-Muslim by any means. I work very, very closely with Muslims all over the world, but much of my work in the Middle East has been at the invitation of Muslim leaders. It's just moderate Muslim voices, voices that are trying to make a difference, and voices that are as threatened by ISIS as Christians are. But the fact is that this is a religious movement, and every member of ISIS, identify themselves as being a part of this religion. And so, we have to face that as a reality and not be afraid to talk about it and understand how that affects how we deal with them and how they're dealing with that part of the world.
Do you think that some of the messages that are coming from Christian leaders on popular networks, do you think that causes people not to become engaged with what's going on in the Middle East?
Well, I think there are lots of reasons why people are engaged. I think one reason is we just aren't educated. We don't know what's happening, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote Defying ISIS. I wanted to make sure people were educated on the crisis. I think secondarily, when it comes to education, I think the average Christian in the West hasn't a clue there are even Christians in Iraq and Syria. I think probably that's true of many Christians in the United States. And then, for sure, we're, lots of different sort of aberrant, Christian ideas and theologies make us more self-centered and more self-focused. That's the issue with certain theological movements like the prosperity gospel. It becomes all about you, and it becomes less about, what the gospel was meant to do, which was to, allow us the opportunity to share the love of Christ with the whole world in very, very tangible forms. And so, I think it's a combination of reasons why we have not paid attention to these people and to this crisis. And by the way, I don't think it's a small reason. I think it's quite a big reason that we don't actually think it's a threat to us. And so, we feel sorry for these people, but, I've got my life and my job and my family, and I'm moving along, and I don't have very much time, and I'm feeling the stresses of my life. And, one of the points I make in the book, in fact, the second part of the subtitle of the book is, about the threat in our own backyard. And the fact is, we will deal with it there. We'll be forced to deal with it here. We'll stand up for those people there. There won't be people that stand up for us here. It's an urgent moment for us to pay attention to.
And again, your book is Defying ISIS. This is an excellent book by Johnnie Moore. And Johnny, talk about the history of Assyria and its importance.
Yeah, well, to the point I was making earlier, I think most American Christians haven't a clue there are any Christians at all in Iraq and Syria. And actually, Iraq and Syria and Egypt have long had the largest Christian populations going back for thousands of years, 2,000 years to the time period of Jesus and the apostles. So of course, Syria is the country within which Paul was headed on the road to Damascus, when he was converted. The church in Antioch was in Syria. It's in Syria, Antioch. And that church was the strongest church in early Christianity, even stronger than the church in Jerusalem. In fact, the church in Jerusalem was having a crisis at one point, and it was the church in Antioch that provided humanitarian assistance to the church in Jerusalem. And by the way, Christians in Syria are the only Christians left in the world that still speak the exact dialect of Jesus, Aramaic. And then Iraq, Iraq is the cradle of civilization. It's, between the Tigris and the Euphrates that we believe that creation happened. It's the land where Abraham was from, and the land where Jonah preached, and the land where Nahum preached, and it's a land that converted to Christianity because the Apostle Thomas came preaching the gospel with the message of Jesus in the very first century, in the very first moments of the growth of the church. And the list goes on and on and on. And, recently ISIS destroyed a monastery, as they destroyed so many churches. And the monastery wasn't far from Mosul, and it was founded in the 4th century. It was 1,600 years old, and it had been a place of Christian worship for 1,600 years. And now it's ashes.
And your book pointed out, for instance, the tomb of Jonah was destroyed, wasn't it?
Yeah, and this is what's so crazy. The tomb of Jonah was in Mosul, and it was both a Christian and an Islamic holy site. It was a place where Christians and Muslims have made pilgrimages for centuries, literally centuries. And one of the first things ISIS did when they took over Mosul is they put bombs throughout the entire building, and they blew it to ashes. But actually, in the book, I talked about a conversation I had with the Archbishop of Mosul, the Syriac Orthodox Archbishop, and he was telling me about the moment when this happened, when they blew up Jonah's tomb, and with this look of defiance in his own eye, and probably this conversation is what inspired my book titled Defying ISIS. He looks at me and he says, they bombed the tomb of Jonah, but in so doing, they inadvertently discovered the ruins of an ancient church we didn't even know existed. And he looked at me, this archbishop who had been kicked out of his city, who nearly lost his life, who had no church or people left, and didn't even have his own Bible. And he looked at me and he said, they bombed the tomb of Jonah and inadvertently uncovered the ruins of an ancient church, because the gates of hell will never prevail against the church. And that's what I saw over and over in Iraq. I saw Christians that had been absolutely destroyed. Christians whose homes had been taken and money had been taken, whose lives had been robbed from them. Christians whose kids had been sold into slavery, and Christians who had lost spouses and other relatives and family members. Christians who lost every single thing. And yet, if you go all across northern Iraq, the one thing that you see again and again on refugee tent after refugee tent, in refugee camp after refugee camp, as you see the Christians have put crosses all over everything. They even tattooed crosses on their skins, and they wear crosses around their necks, and they put crosses at the entrances of their tent, because they believe that Jesus is not only worth living for, he's worth dying for.
That's a great message. Now, from your perspective, how do we defeat ISIS?
Well, I mean, it's a big, complicated question, isn't it? And it was much easier to do, by the way, more than a year ago when we first started seeing evidence of this. But the general American foreign policy was to just let the Middle East take care of itself, and so we just sort of stood on the sideline, and in so doing, we allowed all these bad actors to gain increasing strength and territory, and it festered and it grew, and now, ISIS controls one contiguous piece of land that's larger than the UK between Iraq and Syria. Not to mention, the whole northeast of Nigeria, which, Boko Haram, which has pledged its allegiance to ISIS in effect, controls, and large portions of Libya that ISIS now controls, and even segments of Egypt and the parts of Yemen that haven't been fully taken over by the Shiite militia that's been charging the capital and trying to take over the country. I mean, a while ago it would have been much easier to take care of ISIS, and now it's much more complicated. But there is one thing that is absolutely true, and no one wants to face this reality. But the fact is, the only way to destroy them is going to be boots on the ground. I mean, it absolutely has to be, and there doesn't necessarily have to be American boots on the ground. But if it isn't American boots, it has to have American support, because no one else in the region has the resources to do it. And so that's just what's going to have to happen. It won't be a victory won 30,000 feet in the air by dropping bombs.
Again, the book is Defying ISIS by Johnnie Moore. In the closing minutes, can you talk about some of the organizations you support that our listeners may want to support that you feel are doing a good job in this region?
Yeah, and I think this is what we need to do. Most of us aren't, we aren't in government, right? We can't call these, make these decisions. Of course, we have to put pressure on government to make the right decisions, but what we can do as individuals is we can help with the humanitarian crisis. And by the way, a humanitarian crisis is a security crisis. They all go together. We have to address both. And by the way, ISIS wins anyhow if all these people die of starvation and a lack of shelter. And so there are lots and lots of organizations that are doing great work. And, normally I just say support your favorite organization, but my favorite organizations are, organizations like World Health. It's been at work in the region for a long time. And, I personally give a great deal of money to World Health at worldhealth.net, and they're really, really working hard. And then there's the Cradle Fund, cradlefund.org, which I was a part of helping found, which is working with a number of organizations and church communities on the ground. And so the Cradle Fund has vetted a number of partners that are actually distributing aid in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. They work with local organizations on the ground, and they make sure that all the aid is distributed with both a short-term plan and a long-term vision in mind. And then, of course, all the big humanitarian organizations, both secular and religious, they're significantly at work in the region. But all of them, 100% of them, are under-resourced. And this is, objectively speaking, and according to the United Nations, by the way, the worst humanitarian crisis of our modern era. And by the way, it also might be called the least paid attention to humanitarian crisis in our modern era. And if we don't save the lives of these people, we're going to have a bigger problem on our hands before we know it.
Again, the book is Defying ISIS by Johnnie Moore. I highly recommend this book. Johnnie, thank you so much for joining us this week. And I know and I hope many of our listeners join in and help with this pressing need.
Thanks very, very much for having me and for shining a light on this crisis.
And joining me this week is Mary Joyce. Mary Joyce has worked for 2 major metropolitan newspapers as a writer, artist, columnist, and feature editor. In addition to 4 other books, Mary Joyce is the author of Cherokee Little People Were Real, and her website is skyshipsovercashiers.com. She has spoken about Cherokee Little People on ABC TV in Asheville and Fox TV in Greenville. She also has been a guest on national radio programs, including Coast to Coast AM. And now she joins us here on The Bruce Collins Show. Mary, welcome to The Bruce Collins Show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, it's great to have you on. Now, before we talk about your book, I want to focus a little bit on your website. The subtitle to your website is The Greater Cashiers Area May Be the New UFO Hotspot. First, where's Cashiers and what has been happening there?
Okay, it's in the mountains of western North Carolina. It's up at the top of the mountains, and it's a place where a lot of people in the lowlands escape to when the weather gets too hot. So it's a real tourist destination in that respect. It gets quiet in the wintertime, though. But we've had lots of UFO sightings there. They've actually gone back many, 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 many years, but we've had the website since 2008, and we continue to see a variety of different kinds of UFOs. We also had the Little People stories are just north of there. We have Bigfoot stories just north of there. There's an underground facility not too far from there. There's just lots of stuff going on up here. So if anybody likes mysteries, it's a good place to start scouting.
Interesting. Now, I know a lot of times, like in Hudson Valley, for instance, there's UFO flaps where you see a lot of UFO activity. Is that kind of what is happening in Cashiers, or it kind of sounds like this has been over a long period of time?
This has been over a long period of time because the Indians, back in their history, talked about things like that happening. There's a mountain there called Whiteside Mountain. It has a lot of crystal in it. And it's speculated that that is like an omni that, can help guide ships in. But we see them, different kinds, and it's never really stopped. It's not like you can go out every night and expect to see one, but they are fairly frequently seen.
That's interesting. And I've had guests on who talked about Point Pleasant, and there had been Native American rituals in that area. Native Americans were there. And then they've had UFO activity, Mothman activity, Bigfoot activity. Why do you think this is all happening in the same area?
I think that they're energy centers many, many times. At least the one is here. And I think that has a lot to do with it. Back in the 50s, there was he's called an avatar. His name is Mayor Baba. And he went across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast, went by car, deliberately went through Cashiers because he said it was an ancient holy place. So that was in the 50s, and he was referring back to even before that. So it's been an ongoing center of a spiritual and energy.
Yeah. So, as you said, there's a lot of UFO activity in Cashiers. What about alien abductions?
If there's been any, I don't know about them. We haven't heard anything of that nature. We've had people, one person in particular, saw a small scout ship actually land in a field behind where she lives. Looked a little bit like the Billy Meyer sketches that they do, that, you know, the dome kind of ship. And actually, the very first photo that started or inspired us to do the website was taken by an 8-year-old. And the night before, her mother went down to the kitchen to get a snack, and when she looked outside, it was really, really bright, and it was nighttime. And she thought, well, my God, this can't be the full moon. And she went and looked, and there was a ship hovering over her backyard. Of course, the next day, she was talking about it with her mother, so it's 3 generations in the same house. And the little 8-year-old heard it, and I'm sure that inspired her, because the next day when they went to the grocery store right down in the heart of Cashiers, she started taking pictures of the sky and got a perfect stereotype UFO, you know, the one that they always put in the artwork, smack in the middle of the sun. So they couldn't see it. She didn't know she was taking it. But when they looked at the photo she'd taken, then you could clearly see it. And that's sometimes the case. Sometimes you only see things because of the camera.
There have been Bigfoot sightings in this area. Do you have any stories you could tell our listeners?
I've interviewed 5 local people about Bigfoot stories, and the best one is a man, a military guy. He had to retire early, so we're not talking an elderly man, but he had some kind of a health problem. He moved to a place in the national forest, or up against it, and he heard one night this kind of sound where a Bigfoot will take a branch or a heavy branch and bang it against a tree. It's pretty well known in the Bigfoot research that that's one way that they communicate. And that was his first signal. And then he heard, he thought like it was children playing in the stream, which was about 30 feet from his house. But there's no kids around where he lives. It's very isolated. And that made him kind of wonder. And then he began to hear grunts and groans and different kinds of sounds. And it really was cinched when he was out on his porch one night, and he's up above an old logging road, and he's up above the creek. And he has a light by his garage where he parks his car. And he saw this Bigfoot go across the road. And behind that one came 2 smaller ones, and then came one that was even larger. Well, he came to realize that whenever the Bigfoot are going out into open space, it's always the female that went first, then the children, and then the adult male. And eventually this man befriended these Bigfoot. I shouldn't say all of them. He only got the male to really come up and to where he would garden. And he started sharing food from his garden with him, and if he had leftover food from meals, he would take it down, I think, close to the creek, and give them food that way. So he named him Fred, and that's probably the most, interesting local story, because the other ones were primarily sightings.
The commercial claims that the Bigfoot likes beef jerky, but I don't think that's it.
I'll have to tell him that.
You were talking about UFOs and all these different things like Bigfoot and the Mothman, and how these are spiritual or energy areas. That last story seemed to suggest these are physical beings and maybe even some type of primate. But do you think there are paranormal properties to Bigfoot?
Yes, there seems to be. I think I have more and more reason to believe that they are able to materialize and dematerialize.
Yeah.
There's people who've said they've done that. I'm working on a story right now. It'll get posted eventually, but it's one of those situations where a Bigfoot-like creature, and I'm not sure it's the same thing, materialized and dematerialized in front of somebody. I'm doing some research with one of the most highly respected elder here with the Cherokee, and hopefully we'll meet with him this week, because I want to give him the rough draft of what I've written so far, because I think it fits in with some of their ancient wisdom stories. So it's going to be interesting to try to tie that together.
Yeah, I've heard that a story where a family, I guess, was in their vehicle and they were traveling down some lonely, dark, foresty road, and a Bigfoot walked in front of their car and their engine shut off, and that seemed to suggest some type of a paranormal property.
Well, the other thing, and again, I don't know for sure. I only try to put stuff on the website where I got real confidence that behind it. But you hear all these other things, and sometimes there seems to be a correlation between some UFOs and Bigfoot.
Right.
If that's true, then that would make a lot of sense about the power in the car going out, because UFOs hovering over cars have often shut down the electronics of a car.
That's
and I would almost lean that way rather than the Bigfoot, but who knows?
Yeah, that's interesting. And wouldn't that kind of perhaps suggest that, or maybe not, I guess the bigger question is, are UFOs and Bigfoot terrestrial or extraterrestrial?
Well, we're very convinced that we have both man-made UFOs in this area and ones from far away. I'm always a little bit more suspicious of the smaller triangular ones. I think they're much more likely to be man-made. We do have some underground facilities here, which, we know the military is involved with them, but we see a lot of UFO activity around them. So, they may be working hand in hand.
And that's interesting because I've heard about that. It's known as PERI, is that right?
Yes, it's the Pisgah Astronomical Research Institute, and it's nicknamed PERI. It used to be a place during the Department of Defense ran that during the Cold War. We had one man come forth, and he did it in a very, very careful way because he was giving out information that he's not supposed to give out. But he said there are at least 6 stories deep at the Perry Center. It's a fully contained city. It's self-sufficient. And there's some lakes around it that aren't that far away. And we've had more than one witness talk about UFOs going in and out of that lake. So, it's lots of mysteries up here. We only get some of the answers.
Can you tell me the story about the holographic Jesus?
Sure. Actually, this is the same woman whose daughter got the picture of the first UFO on the website, and she is very, very close to the Whiteside Mountain. She has seen UFOs now since 2008. Before she lived there, she had never seen a UFO in her life. One night, she was just resting in her bay window, looking up at the sky, and she saw a UFO way up in the sky. Didn't think too much of it because she, by that time, gotten used to them. But all of a sudden, there was this beam of light that came down from the ship down to the parking area next to her house. And then she heard this big, loud noise to the side of her house, and she said it really frightened her. And she kind of froze for a minute. And then when she turned and looked, there was this huge hologram of Jesus, and she knows how tall her house is, so she was able to estimate the height of it. She said it was 30 to 35 feet in height. It stayed there, it's been a while since I've read it. I would say maybe 20 minutes. And it was moving a little bit. She said his hair, was like it was in a breeze. And there's 2 things that really made me pay attention to her story. Number one, she was raised Jewish, so there's no reason that she would, start conjuring up images of Jesus. And then the hologram had like a necklace around it made out of a leather strap with a pouch on it. Now, in every depiction of Jesus I've ever seen, there's never been anything like that. And yet at that time, they had to have money. I don't think they had pockets like we have, at least not in a big way. And that probably was a way of carrying coins.
Interesting. Now, some people might dismiss this and say, well, it's just a base. But yet you wrote an article in your local newspaper, and what happened?
Oh, yeah. That was one of the things that really surprised us. That newspaper is in Cashiers, and Cashiers is really a very small community. Paper is small. Circulation is small. But we wrote an article that we sent in to the newspaper, and they printed it. About 10 days later, I got a call from somebody involved with MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. And he had gotten a call from a friend of his who was a pastor, and the pastor's son flew on Air Force One, I guess, on a regular basis. And he said that they were discussing that article on Air Force One, which really kind of surprised us. Which means that they know, somebody knows there's a lot of activity up here.
Yeah. And they're monitoring things around there.
Right.
That's fascinating. Now, so before we talk about your book, Cherokee Little People Were Real, which is also a very fascinating topic, about this base, based on the eyewitnesses, the people who have worked there that have come forward probably in anonymity, what have they
absolutely without their names.
Yes. What have they told you about this base?
The things that were told to me absolutely would be what I mentioned earlier, that it's a self-sufficient underground facility. The top floor, or the top level, surface level, is an astronomical research base with outdated equipment, really. And they will have students and things like that come in. Generally speaking, you don't get in there unless they have an open day or it's by appointment setting it up. There are times when people have seen guards at the gate that are in almost like sniper uniforms, that have the military uniforms. Other times you don't see anything at all. So there's something going on there. Yeah. There have been military vehicles that are seen in the closest larger town called Rosman, and they'll see military vehicles driving around. There's no base right here. Why do we see those around that area? And again, we see and hear the stories of the UFOs going in and out of the nearby lake. One of the witnesses that came forward said that not only is there some interaction with the UFOs, but that they're doing genetic, experiments there. Another person said that it would be a likely place that an enemy would bomb. I don't know.
Wow. It sounds like another Area 51 almost.
Yeah, and it's not the only one, because under Cherokee, North Carolina, is not that far away from Cashiers. If anybody gets out a map, it's right next to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And that's the most recent underground facility that's been revealed. And we have a segment on the website called Deep Throat Testimonies. Those are testimonies where the people really can't identify themselves. But it's a military witness. He got pictures of one of the planes, cargo planes, making drops where all of this has been going on. There's been rumblings under the ground. There's been sounds where it sounds like giant pole drivers. I don't know. I don't have the right word for it. Where they put in beams for like bridges and stuff, and they have to pound them in with big equipment. They hear those kind of sounds coming from beneath the ground. That was going on for a while. We don't hear those sounds anymore, so they must have finished their construction. But things are getting dropped from cargo planes down into this area, and they now have that area a no-fly zone. They say it has something to do with, not wanting to spook the elk. But that's ridiculous, because on the road between North Carolina and Gatlinburg, Tennessee, there's a visitor center, and the elk are right there, and it doesn't seem to spook them at all. So that's just a bogus story about why you can't fly there.
Yeah, no fly zone unless you're flying a UFO. And I want to remind our listeners, we're speaking with Mary Joyce. She's the author of the outstanding book, Cherokee Little People Were Real. And you can find out more about her, about UFOs and cashiers, about her book at skyshipsovercashiers.com. Now, Mary, I want to talk about your book, Cherokee Little People Were Real. How did this topic become of interest to you?
I moved here in 1998. At that point, I knew nothing about Cherokee Little People. Where I live, there are a lot of Cherokee that live in the area, and I began to hear these stories, and they sounded like the old legends, and I didn't pay much attention. And one day, a man came into where I was working, who I knew, and he was very well respected in the community, World War II hero. He was a pastor for over 40 years. He's written 4 books. I mean, he just has a stellar reputation. Mm-hmm. And he said, no. He said, there really were little people. And he was one of the people who was involved with construction projects at Western Carolina University, which is in Cullowhee, North Carolina. Again, that's in this basic part of the mountains here. And he was involved with cutting out a new basement beneath a building. It sounds backwards, but they had 2 floors, and then they cut in from the hill and created a basement underneath it. In the process of it, they found these little tunnels. So he was the first witness. Then he introduced me to another man, and eventually these old-timers, most of them were like in their 70s and 80s at that time, began to tell me their construction stories. And throughout the campus, when they built different buildings, they would find these. They were always built in that real dense red clay, always square cut except the rounded top. And if you know anything about engineering, the rounded top makes the tunnel stronger. And these tunnels, were like a network where the university is built. One of the men that he introduced me to had worked on the original construction of this building. It's known as the McKee Building. And when they first built it and they cut into supposed virgin land, they found other tunnels there. Later, they were found all over the campus. Now, here's one of the interesting stories. There were 2 Indian mounds on the campus at one time, a big one and a small one. The big one, the old-timers remember when it had a shaft, a vertical shaft that went right down through the middle of it vertically. And eventually, when they started doing the construction projects, they found out these tunnels connected to this big Indian mound. The old-timers said it wasn't a traditional mound. It was where all this dirt had been piled up from building some of these tunnels, which is very, very interesting. At the same time, when they were doing these digging projects, they did find little skeletons. And the best story that I have regarding the skeletons is they had this one skull that was child-size, and one of the science professors kept it on his desk almost like a decorative paperweight. And he just said, well, it was a Cherokee child skull. One day another teacher came by, picked it up, looked at it real closely, and said, this isn't a child's skull. It has all its wisdom teeth. And as you know, you have to be 18, 19, 20 years old to hatch wisdom teeth.
Yeah, that's right. Do these skeletons still exist?
According to some of the people who have gone through the anthropology department at that college, they do have them in the forensics lab. The university has been very tight-mouthed about all of this because they just want to build more buildings.
Right.
And so what they've done is they've tried to cover these kind of things up because you have to come to a screeching halt, at least for a while, when things like this are found. And so, a lot of things have been kind of hidden away or destroyed or buried someplace else. Since the book came out, one man contacted me, and he had been a student at Western Carolina University, and he and some buddies were down by the river one day, and the head of security at that time came by where they were, and he had a box that he described as being bigger than a shoebox. And the guy told him that these were the little bones that they had found at their most recent project, and he was taking them to rebury them somewhere else.
Fascinating. So then my next question was going to be, have they ever tried to date the origins of these skeletons? But obviously not.
No, they haven't.
Now, one thing I want to restate before we go on that I think is very important, because a lot of people listening might say, okay, tunnels, maybe animals created these tunnels, but you're saying they were a very distinct shape, right?
The walls and the floor are flat, and the top part is arched, and again, that would be for structural reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. So are there ancient manuscripts that talk about these little people, and what do they say about them?
First of all, the reason I wrote the book is that I really stumbled upon information that nobody else had recorded. I didn't set out to write a book. In fact, the original interviews I did back in 2000, 2001, and then this past almost a year ago, I decided this really needed to be in real book form, and I went and I got photos and I got location maps, and with the hope that not only would the information be preserved, but maybe in the hands of a good archaeologist, it could be used as a guide to finding even more information. And there's more to be found. I got a call from somebody who had done construction here, well, maybe 5 miles from the campus, and he is a well-known construction person in the area. And when he was cutting out the side of a mountain to do a project, he found 5 of these little tunnels. And a couple things surprised him. Number one, they were only like 2 feet across and maybe 3.5 feet high, or 3 feet high, something like that. And when they cut into this side of the mountain, he said those tunnels were as fresh as if they had been built, yesterday. There were no cobwebs, nothing like that. He also noticed that there were little groove marks on the walls, like a tool had been used to, flatten things out. So there's still more things to be found.
And have they ever found any? This may sound strange. Living quarters or anything like that among the tunnels? Well,
no. I really wish we could get deep into some of these. I really, really do. One of the researchers who you've had on your program, Dr. Artie Six Killer Clark, I think you had her on real recently, right?
Yes, that's right.
And she is the one who's really studied the old stories and legends of Native Americans all over the country. I quote her in my book, just a long paragraph, and what she had learned a long time ago from the elders was that the Cherokee originally came from the Great Lakes region to this area. And when they first got here, they found these neatly tended gardens, but they didn't see any people. And what happened was, eventually they saw these little people come out from the ground, tend the gardens at night, and so the Indians originally called them the Moon People for that very reason. They had a different description. In fact, we have 3 descriptions of little people. We have those that look like the Cherokee, only a smaller version. We have those that are called the Moon People, who had bluish skin and larger eyes. And then we have the ones described that almost like a leprechaun. They had red whiskers. And what's interesting is back in 1940, apparently there was a really historic flood here. And a 5-year-old boy found this oval metal medallion-like. It has what I'll call a leprechaun face on each side. It was made out of really heavy metal, and that kind of supports the description of the red-whiskered little people. the Cherokee did not like the red-whiskered ones, and they tried to kill them off. They liked the ones that looked like them. One of the things that supports that possibility or that story is that back in the 30s during Prohibition, some of the moonshiners were doing this moonshine still way off in the woods at the top of Cullowhee Mountain Road. And when they were digging, they found a pile of little people bones. They covered them over because they didn't want anybody to know about it or to know where their still was. So the story didn't come out until after Prohibition was over.
The little people of the Cherokee have been described, I've read in other publications and on the internet, in Native American folklore as a race of spirits. But the skeletons would suggest they were not supernatural, but that they were physical, or were they both?
We may be talking about two different kinds of entities.
Yeah.
Because the ones we're talking about are very physical. To this day, there are Cherokee who say there are still little people in the more remote parts of the mountains, especially on the reservation. And some of them still to this day put out food for them. They claim that if they don't put food out, that things like pebbles will be thrown on their rooftop to remind them that it's feeding time. I've talked to many of the Cherokees who swear that there are still some here.
Is there any way, and I realize this was years ago, is there any way to link this to UFO activity?
One of the people that I interviewed was because she's passed away. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Solly. Solly was the hero of the Cherokees here. I won't get into that whole story, but he's very revered. She said that the little people originally came from the stars, which also fits in with their belief about themselves, because they believe in ancient times they came from the Pleiades.
You said when the tunnels were uncovered, there were no cobwebs. Does that make you wonder if these tunnels that were uncovered in that area, at least up until the point of them being discovered,
they were still being used?
Exactly.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it?
It does.
Like I said, if you get short on mysteries, this is a wonderful place to be.
Yes, absolutely.
Sometimes we get the complete answers, and sometimes we just get more mystery.
Other than, saying that these could be beings from another planet or another dimension, are there any other ideas about why these people were so little?
I've heard bits and pieces. I don't have a working theory. How's that for an answer?
No, that's fine. Hey, Mary, this has been absolutely fantastic. Again, the book is Cherokee Little People Were Real. I hope people pick up a copy of your book. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with you. I know a lot of your listeners are out of Florida, and we have a lot of Floridians that come to North Carolina when the weather gets too hot in Florida. It's a great vacation spot, and if you want to make a trip even more interesting, take the book along and do a little digging around for yourself.
I might do that myself. And again, the website is skyshipsovercashiers.com. Mary, right. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to thank my guests tonight, Johnnie Moore and Mary Joyce, both of them very thought-provoking. And I find the UFO phenomenon curious in the way that I find atheists curious. And that is to say, why would aliens go out of their way to show a holographic image of Jesus Christ? And the author, Mary Joyce, is also has a book about Jesus where she claims that Jesus was married and I believe fathered children. But why do atheists bother with trying to disprove God and Jesus Christ if they don't exist? And why does the UFO community try to either paint Jesus as an alien or paint him as a human who had children and had a wife? Why go out of your way unless maybe the truth is right in front of us, that Jesus was who he said he was, that he died for our sins, and guess what? We can't find a body. He's risen. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Bruce Collins Show, where you can find us every Friday night at midnight here at WWPR 1490 AM. Remember, God loves you. We do too. Don't give up.